Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to the Catholic Mama, where you'll learn how to deepen and defend your faith, find comfort as we share the vocation of parenthood, and learn how to raise your children confidently Catholic. I'm your host, Christine Mooney-Flynn. Let's get started. Hello and welcome back to the Catholic Mama. I'm your host, Christine Mooney-Flynn, and today I'm joined by Dr. Rachel Fulton Brown, who is the Associate Professor of History at the University of Chicago. I was introduced to Rachel from my husband because she was on his podcast, and he said, she really has really dived deep into Mary. And at the time I was going through a Marian consecration. He's like, you should look into her. And so I did. And I'm so thankful that you have agreed to be on my show. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So that was a very brief introduction, and we talked about this. I know that was like as short as it could get, but I know that you are a convert to Catholicism, and I don't know if it came through. Was it through the process of learning about Mary? Was that right?
Yes, very much so.
Okay, go ahead.
And I'd say, it's been you can tell conversion stories, long and short. The short version is I was received into the church 2 years ago. And that I realized it was time to sort of make the move when at the time when I sent my book to press, right, and recognized that I just found what I was looking for. But the long version of the story is I've been on this journey since maybe since I was confirmed in the Presbyterian Church when I was growing up. Definitely since college when I started the research that I do on the medieval devotion to Mary. So I can tell any version of the story that you like.
Well, and I'm sure you get this all the time, specializing in medieval history. My little knowledge of that time period is very different from what it actually was. It's not the Dark Ages.
No, it's the Light Ages.
Yeah. So, I really had no idea until relatively recently that there's such a rich intellectual history from that time. So I'm so happy that I get to talk to you about this. So, it all is woven together for you. So if you can briefly introduce yourself a little bit better than I just did.
Oh, that was fine. So I teach at the University of Chicago. I've been there since 1994. I teach in the history of Christianity and the history of European civilization. I also have the pleasure of teaching a course on J.R.R. Tolkien every 3 years. Which is, in fact, I do stealth theology in a lot of different ways, and that's one of them. So I, as a scholar, have been working on the devotion to Mary pretty much my entire career. Every time I try to get away from it, it just doesn't work, right? And I'm also a blogger. Your listeners might be interested to look at my Fencing Bear at Prayer blog. And in that, there's a post there called "Isn't That a Bit Narrow?" That I wrote back really at the beginning of the blog, and it was the beginning of the work on this second book project the book that I just published. And I'm talking in that post about a reception that I went to for Phi Beta Kappa inductions, and one of the students at the reception, he was graduating, and he asked me, what do you work on? Right. And I said, well, I'm starting this project on prayer to Mary and thinking about the hours of the Virgin and the way in which this was a practice that everyone in Europe participated in the later Middle Ages, every Christian. And, the basis of the practice of saying the rosary and so forth and so on. And he looked straight at me and said, isn't that a bit narrow? and I said, well, I talk about in that post about this problem of, every single time I've tried in my own scholarship to move away from this core, right? This core of trying to understand where Mary fits in Christianity, what the devotion to her actually shows us. Even though in academia this has not been necessarily the smartest move on my part, I get drawn back in, in that meditation I'm talking about. What does it mean to be narrow? What does it mean to have an actual clear focus to your work? This big question that that opens out into like all the mysteries of civilization. And I talk in the talk there about the way Chesterton describes the difference between the cosmopolitan who knows, every city as if it's the same city, and the villager who knows the people who he lives with in this, quote, limited community, and in fact knows all of humanity. So it's a funny sort of specialty that I have, because as far as I'm concerned, it does open me out to, in fact, the full question of what Christianity is and what Christianity shows us about who we ought to be as human beings.
Right. I mean, I think it was Fulton Sheen who said something about how, or it's probably many Catholics who have said to know Jesus, you need to know his mother. And that's really, you can't get away from her.
You can't get away from her. And I say that with the sort of, this irony, because in academia, you're never supposed to work on right now on concrete problems, right? We're always supposed to be working on theorizing. And so, the proper answer to that question of what do you work on is not, devotion to the Virgin Mary. It's, processes of identity making in, social something like that. I can't even parody it. Right.
I went to school for anthropology, so I'm familiar with exactly what those things sound like.
You might be able to do it better than I can. I certainly can.
You mentioned how it's, you're doing something concrete even though you specialize in Christianity, do you find in academia, it's usually so secular, the other professors or if there's other professors doing Christianity or the students that come through, are they religious?
Well, this is, I've mentioned my fencing bearer at prayer blog. My fencing bearer at prayer blog is also famous for the place where I write about Milo. Mm-hmm. And, I started writing about him the year he was doing his campus tour, going around campuses.
Okay, yeah.
And, giving his speeches. And I was asked to do a little essay for Sightings, which is our newsletter from our divinity school, about what I saw the significance of the reactions to his talks were. There are layers and layers of those reactions, right? But what I said in that piece was what I saw was the religious crisis. What the reaction Milo's talks showed was how deep the religious crisis is in our culture, particularly our academic culture, and that what we were failing to do, I thought, as academics, was acknowledge that level of difficulty that we have in talking through theological questions, and that what I said, I thought my colleagues were doing was basically they're teaching a theology. They teach race, class, and gender as I see it as they're teaching them as axioms of their own faith, and multiculturalism, which of course is typically anti-Christian in its expression, and that it would, from my perspective, would be more honest if they would simply recognize that they have a faith and a sacred project, as Christian Smith put it in one of his books on sociology, and they're denying it. Well, of course, in the reactions to my piece, they did, which only, as far as I was concerned, proved my point, right? The divinity school itself put 29 of my colleagues in the divinity school signed an open letter, and it's posted still on their website saying, Professor Fulton Brown does not represent our diversity. Well, yes, you don't. I don't, clearly, because I'm calling for a sort of upfront recognition of the necessity to be able to recognize the theological underpinnings of our culture. We could disagree on what those theological underpinnings are, but it was interesting to me that they weren't even willing to acknowledge that they have them.
From the divinity school.
From the divinity school, right?
That
yes. Yes. So yes, to your question, are they mainly secular?
That's a yes.
Depends on what you mean by secular.
Yeah. Man. All right. So let's go back to this work and if it was too narrow or not. But when you started doing the devotion to Mary, did you come? No, you didn't come in as a Catholic, right? At that point.
No.
Okay. So what made you decide on Mary?
So in the long version of the story, right, I go back to college, and I'm in college in the 80s, and I'm, of course, taking gender studies courses because you did. I think from my anthropology professor, we did Well, of course you did, because
yeah,
it was
of course, yeah.
a range of things that we were looked at. And some of the things, one of my friends went off to Swarthmore, and she came back having done a course on feminist theology. And so I was curious about that, and I read a lot of the books that she recommended. I was also taking classes in medieval history, and had, as a high school student, had the good fortune of going on a trip with some of my teachers for a month. And of the many places we visited, we went to Chartres, and I was really taken with the imagery in the cathedral there. We had a lovely tour by Malcolm Miller, who's the great guide at Chartres. And all of these things came together. Oh, and also I was a religious studies and history major, and in my religious studies courses, I was also taking courses in New Testament, the letters of Paul, the Synoptic Gospels, the historical Jesus, and so forth. And so you could say it's like all of these things came together, and there's this point at which I basically recognized it as a prayer, right? I wanted to find wisdom. And I actually have the paper, that meditation that I wrote back in 1984 or whatever, this prayer for wisdom. And the only way I can say it now is Mary answered my prayer, right? It's like, yeah, okay, fine. You want to find wisdom? Look for me. And I started working on, I did a paper on Bernard of Clairvaux's sermons and letters on Mary. I went to graduate school in Cambridge. I started in Cambridge, England, and did a study that year on William of Newborough's commentary on the Song of Songs in praise of Mary, which that I'm taking this sort of through a scriptural route is very important. That I grew up Presbyterian, and we were very focused on scripture.
Sure.
And I needed to understand the way in which medieval Christians read the scriptures in praise of Mary. And these Song of Songs commentaries were very, very interesting. So I started with those, building up through my scholarship in looking at the liturgy, looking at the liturgical descriptions of Mary. The new book is on the Office of the Virgin, and it's basically a commentary on the way in which medieval Christians read the Psalms in praise of Mary. So I'd say, I've been on this very intellectual quest, and it's appropriate because, as I found in my work for the second book, Mary is the mother of wisdom. And so, this is why when I finished the book, I'm like, fine, you've convinced me, right? That she is in the 13th century described through all of these great titles, this cascade of scriptural references to her, because she contained the one whom the heavens could not contain. And he's the creator of all, right? So she contains the creator of heaven and earth. To describe her, to understand her, to talk about her, therefore means describing the creation, describing the work that went into making the creation. And so in the 13th century, she becomes the patron of the University of Paris. The Faculty of Arts and Letters take her as their patron. And that's appropriate because she's the mother of the word, and therefore the mother of the one, language, right? The arts of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and so forth. And you realize, just like, this is why I said, like, I studied this little tiny village, right? Devotion to Mary. And it turns into, you have to know everything. You have to know the art, you have to know the music, you have to know the scriptural exegesis, you have to know town formation and architecture, and it's lovely the way, she's this gate to the entire culture and civilization.
That's not narrow at all.
That's not narrow at all.
Was it? I would say, I would think that coming at this from an academic perspective and seeing the evidence, it may have been easier to push aside any not confusion, but hesitance to be Catholic, or maybe not. Were there other things that stopped you from wanting to go fully that route?
There's a post I did on Fencing Bear that's about that old time religion, I think it's called, and I'm talking about growing up Presbyterian and how it seemed to me appropriate that Mary chose me to do this work because I had to come through it to her through the scriptures, which is a very Calvinist approach. But what one of I think paths of conversion are more interesting to the convert than anybody else. That one of the things is I did finally listen to the institutes. I listened to hard books, right? Because I realized I learned very well orally, which I think is appropriate. So I listened to Paradise Lost. That's a much easier poem to listen to than to read. The institutes are so boring, I had to stop listening to them because I was driving, and that was a bad thing. But before I got too bored, I realized that Calvin was drawing on the commentary tradition that I had been studying as a scholar, which I found very, very interesting, that he's quoting Bernard of Clairvaux on the Song of Songs. He claims that what he's trying to rediscover is the wisdom that has been hidden by the scholastics, which, another way of saying it is he's reading the monastic commentators again that I was using. And I feel that I've been guided, right? This was an appropriate journey to take through the recovery of this monastic theology that I do think has been to a certain extent obscured by scholastic methods of proof, right? That the commentary tradition I'm been working with is very liturgical, it's very devotional, it's knowledge through participation in the prayer, in the liturgy, so that you're shaping yourself through saying the Hours of the Virgin, through praying the Song of Songs as part of her liturgy. And if there were barriers, some of it's been, the barriers that modernity has placed on are actually seeing the fullness of the medieval devotion to her. And that's been one of my great, hopes that my scholarship will help people appreciate that what I've written about is a part of the long tradition that even modern Catholics seem not to know at all, right? And I've read Fulton Sheen's book. Patrick Coffin had me on his show, and he told me about, he loves Fulton Sheen, so I needed to read that. And I read the book, and I'm like, even Fulton Sheen didn't know what I know, which is this older, rich tradition that makes Mary even more magnificent than the Venerable Fulton Sheen was able to show.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense because there's so much. What I knew about Mary, I was never against her. Even before I became Christian or Catholic, I just didn't understand what the big deal was. And it took a while of even just searching until I found a couple of books about her. Behold Thy Mother by Tim Staples, or I don't know if you're referencing The World's First Love by Fulton Sheen.
That's the one, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that really was helpful. But I mean, those are both written, pretty recently in the history of all this stuff. So when you say how with these Marian devotions, Catholics this is just part of their tradition. They all did this.
So what I show in Mary in the Art of Prayer is the way the practice of saying the Hours of the Virgin develop. It's a monastic practice to start with from the 11th century or so, and it's an addition to the divine office that the monks and nuns would say that the divine office is the cycle of psalms. And over the course of the 10th and 11th centuries, the monks and nuns start adding this additional set of psalms that they say in Mary's honor. And over the 12th century, 13th century, lay people start sort of asking for a devotion. And this one is the one often recommended to them by the clergy, particularly Peter Damian, who's a great reformer, saying, praying these hours to Mary is this great service that you can do for her. The practice of saying the Ave Maria develops at a similar time, and it's really a practice of saying an abbreviated office of Mary, because the Ave Maria is the opening antiphon for the hours. And so if people couldn't learn the office with all the psalms and all the other chants and lessons, they could say the Ave Maria as a sort of synecdoche for the whole thing, right? It's also during this period that in the Latin Church, you develop things like these litanies, right? Naming her with all of these various titles. And what's interesting about it is everybody who could read in the Middle Ages knew the Hours of the Virgin, because what we know from their book lists and stories of their lives and so forth is that if you could learn to read, you learn to read reading the Office of the Virgin. It's like in English, the books that contain the hours are called primers, for prime, one of the hours, but it's also the first book that you use to learn to read. So it's why we talk about primers in those terms. So it's central to the development of literacy in the later Middle Ages. It's central to the laity's sort of training in prayer. They want it. Like, they ask for books, they get their own. There's a big book market in the later Middle Ages making books of hours for the laity. And when you asked me, who said this? If you could read, you knew it, right? But we also have evidence showing that people could learn it without actually reading it, right? That you can learn the practice without needing a book for it too. So it's totally widespread. And by the 13th century, the expectation is every Christian would be taught the Our Father, the Creed, and the Ave Maria. So it's one of the three central practices of the period.
When did this devotion to Mary fall out of fashion then?
Well, with the Protestants.
Okay. That little thing.
Yes, that whole thing. It has a variety of ways that it falls out. The Protestants, in particular, because of their scriptural studies, reject the books on which the medieval devotion had been primarily founded, particularly Ecclesiasticus, also the Wisdom of Solomon. They also reject the readings of the scriptures that supported a Marian understanding, which is antithetical to the actual, the Christian tradition, since the reason that medieval exegetes saw Mary in the scriptures is the same reason that they saw Christ in the scriptures, because they read the Psalms as written about our Lord Christ. And so seeing his mother in the prophecies and in the Old Testament is consonant with that exegetical tradition. Protestants are focusing on the Hebrew Bible, don't recognize that the Hebrew Bible doesn't contain the Marian element, which is not an accident. And what's interesting, I think, what's hard in the longer tradition is Catholics still know this way of thinking about Mary through the 17th century. Clearly, my book ends with a meditation on Maria of Agreda, who's a 17th century nun, and she writes a book called The Mystical City of God, in which she describes Mary in all of these great.
I just bought that book.
It's a wonderful. It's my favorite.
It's abridged. I have the abridged version.
The abridged version is fine too. It'll convince you to buy the full 4-volume one, because I think it's the most beautiful book ever written. It's magnificent. But in the 18th century, as I show, people like Casanova, the great lover, ridicule it. Casanova is given this book, Mary of Agreda's Mystical City, when he's imprisoned in Venice for having sex with nuns, and he describes her as basically crazy, right? And that sense of this is a ridiculous tradition, I think, affected Catholicism. I don't quite know how it happens in the 19th and 20th centuries, but that exuberance that Mary of Agreda participates in, I think, becomes a little embarrassing to the modern Catholic Church, and they definitely, by Vatican II, decide that they don't need it. And Lumen Gentium just has that chapter 8 at the end. It's like, as far as I'm concerned, that's kind of pushing Mary in the background. And I know there's been efforts to bring her back to the foreground, but if you don't have the fullness of understanding her as wisdom, who is the mother of wisdom, filled with God, I think you really miss out on why she's so significant to our ability as Christians to see God.
Absolutely. Yeah. You mentioned in the litany all the names she has. I just did a consecration in November, and every day for whatever 4 weeks going through. It's amazing to me all the names that she has been attributed with, and they all, you can see if she's named, if somebody thought to name her that, how very important she is.
Well, and recognize that, in the naming of her, you're naming the creator, her creator, our creator. Right. So it's the primary thing that I hope people get from my book is that this devotion to Mary was what's central to it is she opens out and shows you God, right? And it's easier to do this visually. And it's interesting, all of this is easier to do visually, that Christianity is about making God visible, right? The incarnation is a making visible of God. And that she gives birth to him. And the art in the Middle Ages is lovely for emphasizing this opening out of Mary she's the Holy of Holies in which God becomes present. And there's statues that open to show, inside her is the revelation. That, has people worry about, the degree to which she can contain the Trinity. But the thing is, with the incarnation, the Trinity becomes understandable, thinkable, knowable for us. And that's the mystery that those artworks are trying to, I keep having to say, make visible.
Well, it fits. It fits. So you started this project of studying on Mary for a long time. And then your first book, can you say that again?
My first book is From Judgment to Passion, and that one's on the prayers to Mary and Christ, and the commentaries on the Song of Songs, and the devotion to the humanity of Christ, and how devotion to Mary is a part of that devotion.
Okay. I'm going to put all these, I'll put everything, any link or anything that you mentioned in the show notes so people can easily get to that. But how long ago did that book come out?
That one came out in 2002.
So 2002. So, but you said that you didn't come into the Catholic Church officially until a couple of years ago. So what was happening in there with your faith journey?
Well, so after I finished the first book, I realized that what I needed to understand was prayer and how to think about prayer. And my scholarly journey included doing some, quote, retraining in psychology. I took courses here at Chicago for a year with some, I don't know, expectation that studying things like cognitive psychology and social psychology would give me tools for talking about prayer. Well, I came back out of that saying, nope. Because in fact, modern sciences, all of them are, as far as I'm concerned, handicapped by a lack of appreciation of the deep tradition that they're working out of. I mean, psychology should be about the study of the soul. They seem to have forgotten that. And that I realized I needed to develop sort of my own methodology for getting readers inside of these devotional practices. And working on the second book, Mary and the Art of Prayer, took me through that journey, right? That I needed to find both the materials that would show me what medieval Christians were thinking, but also a rhetorical way of helping readers appreciate what I was trying to show them. I mean, some of the works I talk about in the book, there's one that's Richard of Saint Laurent's on the praises of Blessed Mary in 12 books, right? Nobody reads this. It's boring. It's 12 books of titles. Oh my gosh, how dull, right? And my job is to make you realize that this is the most exciting book you've ever read because it's fan fiction, right? It is. You want to know absolutely every single thing you possibly could about Mary, and you do not write 800 pages, which is what he did, of finding Mary in all of the creatures of creation, unless you are in love with her, right? And in love with her, you're in love with God. And in the midst of all of that, I was also learning defense, thus the Fancy Barrett prayer. And I was thinking about ways in which, you train yourself into particular understandings through the practices that you're engaged in. And, you and I were talking before we started, the blog Fancy Barrett Prayer and my book Mary and the Art of Prayer developed in tandem, right? That there was a literally a practical element in the sense of a practice, right? Training my soul to deal with the emotions of losing all the time as a fencer, training myself through all of the temptations of the 7 deadly sins. My biggest one is always envy, because I'm competitive, and translating that into a way that I could show you in my scholarship what it was like to pray, and hold the image of Mary in your understanding, so as to achieve this intellectual and emotional vision of the Creator that she helps you see. And I guess in all of that training, Catholics certainly are very happy to have me, but I don't feel like it was this great gulf that I had to step over. I mean, by the time I was received, it was just like, I'm back, right? I'm home. This is where I should have been all along. And, so I was wandering, but the barrier was not so much, was there a barrier? It was more, I was on the right quest, and I'm now here. I'm home, right?
It just took the time.
It just took the time.
Yeah.
And I do think, and I think the things I discovered, I brought back with me treasures, I hope, that I knew as a scholar, even in medieval history, we don't know this aspect of the devotional tradition, which is, my scholarly reason for writing the book. But also when, by the time I got home, recognizing that even Catholics haven't had access to this tradition for a long time. It's a gift, right? Here I am, my gift that Mary made me make.
Well, that's, I don't want to toot the horns of converts, since I am also one, but I do think that, converts do bring a renewed passion, or just it's like the person who grew up in a town and then the transplant comes in and says, "Oh my gosh, did you know that there's this and this and this you can do here?" And they're like, "What? I've never known that." And I've lived here for 25 years or whatever. So, from that perspective, born and raised Catholics have a wealth of knowledge about a lot of just the culture, the Catholic culture. But the converts are able to bring new fruits, new treasures.
And I've enjoyed that greatly. That this is the opposite of what I've discovered. Is, of course, I had the number of wonderful conversations, rich, spiritual, deep conversations I've had since I've been received has just been magnificent, right? And the other side of me is going, this was here all along, and I didn't know. Right? Of the conversations in the Catholic in the church of things that I wished I'd been able to talk about with people all along, but didn't know where to find them. It's certainly not in academia. There are obviously Catholics in academia, but speaking as a Catholic has opened to me. It's like when you move to the town, right? Finally, you meet the people that you want to be living with. Right. So that's nice too.
that is true. That is true. You actually, you've come home in a lot of ways. So the first book, and then when you mentioned the second book, how did that come out recently?
Yes, last year.
Okay.
It's as far as I'm concerned, it's a new book.
That's new. They take a while to write.
They take a long time to write my book. I'm not a fast writer in those terms.
I'll tell you, I'm sure you're very thorough in your research, which is definitely not going to be quick.
Yes, exactly.
And I know that's an understatement, Joe. So you're becoming more, you're teaching Christianity and medieval history. You're becoming more Catholic as you're going. How do you see yourself moving now in that way? Talking more about Catholicism. I mean, are you going to, I guess I would assume that you're going to continue on this path with your research. What's next?
So another link to add is my page, my academic homepage, where I've posted links to all my courses, my syllabi. And I'm teaching a course this quarter. Actually, the courses I'm teaching this year are helping me set up for my next big, take 15 years to write book, which is on virtue and the training in virtue. And like the second book built on my first book's interest in prayer, the next quote big project is building on understanding that the training I went through in order to write Mary in the Art of Prayer was a training in virtue, and I want to make that more explicit as an intellectual problem and also as a cultural problem in medieval Europe, right? How devotion to Mary helped train Christians as Christians. Excuse me. So I did a course last autumn on virtues and vices, which was very interesting. One of my students was saying, this is the way we should be teaching, theology. And there aren't any, she went and looked at syllabi that the American Academy of Religion had posted and said, I couldn't find anything at all like what we did. I'm like, that's interesting. Again, it's like this medievalist comes in and says, look at these texts, look at this conversation, and finds that indeed nobody now has been talking in those terms. And I've been reading, Servais Pinker's on the sources of Christian ethics and finding out, okay, that's what happened to this conversation, this training in virtue and vice that was typical in the Middle Ages, but has been largely displaced by casuistry and confessional handbooks since then. So that's one aspect of it. And then the course I'm teaching now is on what I called medieval Christian mythology, but it was more to say, is that, we only can talk about religion as mythology now, but there's actually something deeper at the core of Christianity than that. And it's been a very, very challenging course. And that one, the course has a blog where the students are writing reflections on the discussions we've been having in class. And there's a link we can link to the blog too, because I think your listeners would really enjoy seeing how the themes that we've been talking about can be drawn out of these medieval texts that the students and I are talking about. I'm also showing them lots of pictures appropriately.
Good.
And that, make them the theme, right. The blog is called Speculum Aureum, Golden Mirror. And it's the theme of the course is, what it meant to try to see God in through this tradition.
You mentioned that's very fascinating. I'm jealous of your students that they get to engage in all of this. You mentioned mythology, and I want to end. We're running out of time, but we don't have to end on this. But I have a theory, and I just remembered it when you said mythology. And it's just totally, you can tell me this is ridiculous, but I was thinking recently, because you know how unicorns are really big now? Mm-hmm. Right? Everything's a unicorn. It's like, as soon as millennials, I think, tip the scale on their usage in the internet, suddenly unicorn was everywhere. The last time I believe unicorns were really, really popular was the Middle Ages, correct? I mean, they're in art all the time.
They're in art all the time, yes.
Right, and it's Jesus.
It's Jesus.
Yeah, so
yes, you're right. Yeah. Maybe actually that's a wonderful place to end. We should be celebrating the fact that unicorns are everywhere, because it's like the symbol, and all we need is the Virgin for the unicorn to go lay his head in her lap.
I think now that unicorns are coming back in a sense of self-possession and self-esteem, like in a bad way, self-esteem. It's almost a perversion of what a unicorn really is.
Well, and this is the great challenge, right? It's like if the symbol is there, even though it's being used in this corrupt way, can we recover it?
I'd hope so.
I hope so.
When you said mythology, I was like, oh my gosh, my unicorn theory. I've been talking about this. I mean, only to my husband. I've been talking about this. Like, I think there's something there. There's something, the culture's perverting what a unicorn is, and that's why it's, I don't know.
Well, that's the thing is, that's why, in fact, calling the course medieval Christian mythology is a little bit perverse, in the sense that talking about mythology in this way, we're arguing against Bultmann, the great Protestant theologian from the early 20th century, says his most famous argument is that Christianity needed to be demythologized. We needed to get rid of all the stuff that people can't, find too difficult to believe anymore, like the it's like heaven and earth, miracles, the resurrection. It's like
just those little things.
The incarnation. And so the course is to show the theological richness of this so-called mythology, and how you cannot, it's like, no, there is no Christianity without these challenging stories, because that's the whole point, that God has become incarnate and entered into history.
And that is miraculous. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for being on the show. I was so excited to talk about Mary and the history of it. And I will link to everything. I was jotting notes furiously, so I'll link to everything that you mentioned in the show notes. But I love that you're doing this work, because as I found, Mary is a missing piece, and it's a huge gap if you don't. A friend of mine was saying, she's Protestant, and she was saying she feels like her church's tradition is so dominated by masculine, and she wants a mother figure. And I was like, well, I know a place where you can get that.
Well, but okay, you don't start with that and then expect we're going to finish. But the great thing is, it's not just that if the Protestant church ends up too masculine, the Protestant church ends up sexless without Mary, right? It's like Mary shows the proper relationship between men and women, as well as being this mother figure. And I think that's one of the larger arguments I've also been making, and I need to figure out how to write about this well, that marriage depends upon understanding, this ideal relationship between Mary and God. And if we don't have that in our culture, we're in desperate trouble.
I think we are. Well, hopefully we can bring that back, though. Little by little. That's why we just need Catholics to talk about it, understand it, and talk about it. Actually, I've heard so much lately about theology of the body and that there is a difference between men and women. It's celebrated equal dignity. And I might be living in a bubble hearing that. But at least people in my bubble are talking about that. So,
well, that's a good thing to hear.
Yeah. And if they have kids that are going to be about my kids' age when they get older and they're going to marry those people, that's great. We'll just keep the bubble. I'm fine with that. Well, again, thank you so much, Rachel. This is great. This is wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine.
All right. So for anybody listening, like I said, I'll put all of these very informative links into the show notes, including the names of the 2 books as well. And I hope you enjoyed listening. And if you haven't today, pray your rosary. I think that's a good ending point. Pray your rosary. Until next time, everybody. Don't forget to head over to thecatholicmama.com to get your free copy of How to Talk to Your Kids About God. This handy little ebook will teach you how to broach the topic of God with your children or how to respond to your kids when they want to talk about God, as well as give you answers to 7 of the trickiest questions about the faith that Christian parents face. You'll love the easy-to-understand grown-up answers, the pared-down but not talked-down answers you can share with your kids, plus recommended resources if you'd like to deepen your understanding of the topic. Get yours free at thecatholicmama.com.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.